What's the missing link in local journalism? That's today's big question, and my guest is Lyndsey Gilpin. Lyndsey is the Senior Manager of Community Engagement at Grist. Lyndsey was the founder and executive editor at Southerly, a nonprofit media organization that equipped people who face environmental injustices and are most at risk of climate change effects with journalism and resources on natural disasters, pollution, food, energy, and more. Welcome to Important, Not Important. My name is Quinn Emmett, and this is Science for People Who Give a Shit. Our goal, as always, is to help you answer the question, what can I do? Let's go talk to Lyndsey. Lyndsey, welcome to the show. Thank you for joining me.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
For sure. The last time I was in Louisville was 2009 for the Derby, and we lost my brother for 24 hours. It was great.
That sounds like a Derby experience.
Yep.
We've all had it. Yeah.
My uncle, who loves us very much, was like, it's fine. He'll find his way home. Let's go. So, yeah, he's fine. Yeah. He's alive. So, good town. Good times.
It's changed a lot since then. You should come back. There's so much more food, and obviously they love the bourbon tourism thing. So that's the big thing now. Yeah. People are on that. We're still doing the colonial thing. We also have better food than when I was growing up here. But yeah, you lean on what got you there. I get it. Exactly.
So, Lyndsey, I mentioned offline a little bit before we dive into this. A lot of folks that listen to this are already doing something incredible. They could be, a legislator or a policy maker of some sort, or they could be a third grade teacher or run a college endowment. Who knows? But they're always inspired by and look to folks who are, as we describe it, on the front lines of the future, doing the thing. So I have a two-part question for you. I guess it's one question with two parts. Anyways, this is going great. And it's basically, why do you have to do this job? And the first part is, why do you in particular have to do this job? Like, of all the people in the world, why does this have to be you? And the second part is, why do you have to do this specific work? Of everything you could have done and could do, why this? Let's do this.
Yeah. Okay. All right. I'm going to answer it backwards because I think
you can do whatever you need to do.
I think it's easier to answer the second part first. So I do community engagement at a journalism or at a media organization that covers environmental justice issues nationally. Mm-hmm. And I came at the community engagement, which I can talk about is a very buzzy term that a lot of your listeners have probably heard. I came at that from journalism. I was a reporter and an editor for over a decade. I did the investigative work. I have focused on environmental issues pretty much the whole time, but I did a lot of investigations. I did long form journalism. I had my dream of when I was younger, moving to New York and breaking into the classic, what they tell you that the only way you can succeed in writing is go be a nobody in New York for a while. Luckily, very quickly, I was like, screw that. I don't want to do that. But I've done a lot of different types of reporting and, chasing the story and trying to figure out how to get journalism to people and amplify the voices that aren't amplified enough in our society and in our communities. And I actually came at this particular version of journalism through starting my own magazine, which I ran for 5 years. It was called Southerly. I launched it right after 2016 election. I was out west and I was really frustrated with the way the media was covering the South. And I moved home to Louisville and I was like, all right, I'm just going to start freelancing on the side and seeing if people would be interested in more journalism about environmental justice in the South and communities that are underrepresented and often presented as a monolith in this region. And through that, sort of being able to manage my own publication, I really wanted to make sure that the ethos was always very authentic and trying to make sure that the voices that are often left out of the conversation are able to be represented and people have the opportunity to be part of the journalism process. So we held a lot of community events, panel discussions, listening sessions, like ways to get people involved in journalism and understand what journalism is before the story ran, before, instead of just like coming into their community and telling a story and leaving, we just like really followed up a lot and focused specifically on rural communities, low wealth communities, communities of color. And it was a small scrappy thing, and I was running it mostly by myself. I had some help sort of over the years, like contract workers and people who really like made sure I could keep it going. But in the end, I was like, this is exhausting. I had a baby. I was like, I can't have two babies here.
It's enough.
So,
yeah.
it's a lot. So, but through that work, I became more and more disillusioned with the way journalism in general works. Often, a national magazine or newspaper goes into a place, writes a story, leaves, already has it written in their head what's going to be the story. This is very much the case in environmental crises after hurricanes, like we have just seen. And after chemical spills or oil spills or whatever it may be. And it just sorts of, particularly around climate change issues, like very much focuses on like whether or not people believe in climate change, rather than like, how do we get people engaged on that issue and meet them where they're at? Mm-hmm. And this community engagement sort of like sector of journalism that was kind of becoming more popular over the last few years is like, how do we meet people where they're at? How do we make sure that the information gets to them in a way that makes the most sense, whether that's print or audio or video or canvassing door to door or equipping them to do that journalism themselves. Mm-hmm. And so that is the part that I fell in love with. And that is really when I kind of had this moment, this epiphany, like 5 years into this, where I was like, oh, I don't want to just write anymore. Like, I want to make sure that the stuff that I'm doing and the stuff that other journalists are doing, like the really good work, is actually being seen by the people who need to see it, right? And that to me is much more meaningful and fulfilling than anything I have done before, which, was not something I thought 10 years ago, but I really love it. So a lot of my work now, and the thing that I love most about it is that like, it's very slow going and like one-on-one, and a lot of the impact is very anecdotal. And it's just like, how do we engage people like one-on-one or in a room full of their neighbors and community members and friends and talk about the issues that are most important to them. And so, and in doing that, figure out where they need information, what information they need, what misinformation they have in their lives that we can maybe teach them how to correct or identify. And I think that like, I am not the only person that does this work. I have learned so much from people all over the country in journalism and outside of journalism. Organizers do this all the time, right? This is like community organizing. Like you host an event and you get people talking about an issue that's important to them, and then you try to figure out how to mobilize them in some way around it. And this is very similar in that, like mobilizing them around the importance of information access and journalism, which is something that, journalism as an industry has made very inaccessible. So I am definitely not the, like the only person for this job. I've learned so much about it through other, like mostly hyper local places, mostly people of color doing this work, who have been doing this work for a long time. Some ones I could name that maybe like listeners would know. Outlier Media in Detroit does text-based, SMS-based reporting. Connecta Arizona is a Spanish language outlet in Phoenix and across the border that does WhatsApp messaging. There's been Documenters, which trains people to go to city meetings and document what they see and take notes and publish them. Like there's just so many amazing versions of journalism and getting information out that like I have become more and more passionate about over the last few years.
I love it. Well, that was incredible. Great.
It's a lot.
We're done.
Yeah.
That was amazing. No, that's amazing. I mean, again, following Grist for so long and then following your jump into this truly with 2 feet and going into it, do you have an organizing background of any sort, or was it just like, hold on, I don't want to just write it and move on to the next thing?
No, I don't. I have always been very much a journalist. Like I decided I wanted to be a journalist when I was like 11 years old, and never looked another way, even when everyone was like, "Yeah, you're not going to make any money." you better find something else. I was like,
Right.
no, I'm doing this, And I think the part that sort of separates it from organizing, I think, is that like there's so many principles from it that I find through organizing that are very useful. So like again, like the way we reach people, convening people, kind of giving people agency
Mm-hmm.
over their stories and their experiences, which I don't think journalism often does. But it's also like keeping that line, which I think where the journalism background is really useful, is like there is a line, right, that we can't cross, like for conflict of interest or making sure that people trust that information and know where it's coming from, which is obviously very difficult in today's age. But like journalism historically has been so obsessed with this idea that we have to be objective, which is
Mm.
what the white male editors decided, decades and
Still
decades ago.
deciding.
Right, still
Yeah.
deciding, and a lot of news outlets still are like, you can't have a background in something that you're reporting on, or you're too close to the subject matter. And like, to me and to a lot of people that I have learned from, that is a benefit, right? Like especially in organizing, right? Like if you are organizing around reproductive freedom and you have dealt with some sort of reproductive like injustice, whether that's abortion or teen pregnancy or whatever it might be, like that is an asset. You know that issue and you can come to it in a more educated way. And I think the same is with journalism. Like if you are a Spanish speaker and have dealt with immigration issues and you are a first generation immigrant, like that is an asset if you're trying to report on those communities. Same with people who are enduring, the effects of climate change, who are seeing it like on the coasts or in areas that aren't really getting the resources they need to adapt or like mitigate climate change effects. Like they know what's happening and often have ideas that are more creative or more realistic than like the abstract things that I think like
Sure.
the progressive movement often like comes up with. Like, we should all
Mm-hmm.
do this. And it's like, well, why don't you ask people on the ground what
Yeah,
they need?
that's great.
Yeah.
Let's ask them what they need.
Yeah. Yeah. So journalism doesn't often do that because it's sort of seen as like, but we're asking people too much. Like we're supposed to tell them what they need. Like, we're supposed to just give them information and like let it go. And that is a disservice to people, I think, because you can't just give people like a bunch of stuff and be like, figure it out, best of luck, and
Yeah.
like that's not what we're here for. Yeah.
I think also, and I get it, I understand in certain cases, in some cases, depending on the topic, in most cases, the need for being objective in some way. Obviously, that can lean way too far in the other direction. You can end up being the mouthpiece for something that doesn't need it
Totally.
or hurts other folks. But at the same time, I kind of think of, come back to Ed Yong in two places here, who was at the Atlantic and did all that incredible work for years, and wonderful author. And he just gave a talk recently at the last XOXO conference about, he was like, hey, this is how I realized I needed to do this. And this is how it broke me, because I needed to get too close. And that was really hard. It takes it out of you. And he said at the beginning of the pandemic, and I did a poor man's version of this, that the pandemic exposed, it was like a flood exposing the cracks in our sidewalk, right? And my version was, it's a pop quiz on, hey, here's all the economic and societal choices you made over the past 100 years. Let's see how they go. Not great. But journalism was the same way, which was, and again, we're seeing this with, folks talking about the poor job the New York Times is doing when they refuse to say certain words. The receipts are in a little bit on how that version of journalism has gone, which is being afraid to get too close, being afraid or refusing to hire someone from those communities, if not talk to them, follow up with them. And then what I love about your work is making sure it gets back to them, not just write a story and move on and maybe they never see it. If you're writing about farm workers, which is something I've done, but in much less legitimate way than you have, how do you then get that to them? What does that mean philosophically? What does that mean strategically? What does that mean for Grist's budgets? Who do they need to hire? Who's the best person for that? I remember one of the first conversations I ever had on this show, when I had even less of an idea of what I was doing, was the gentleman whose name I, of course, completely forget. He's a pastor, and he works on climate change from within the evangelical church. And when I asked him, hey, what can we do to help? He said, just give us money to do our jobs, because the messenger actually really matters a lot here. And he's like, you're not the guy. Like, I'm the guy. So just support us and let us do it. But know that the messenger really matters. And it really does. And that's why we're, such big fans here of your work and the 19th and Capital B and all those folks that are like, we're of this community too. It's often not just reporting on something and moving along. It's updates on how this thing is going and how it gives people perspective and helps them make different decisions and get involved in other ways, like you said, recording city council meetings or school board meetings or whatever it might be, or even pamphlets. So, yeah, I get it. I think there's never been a better time for this version of it. Clearly, we need it, the proverbial we, and lots of specific communities need it. I want to go back 1 second, though. You mentioned you wanted to be a journalist since you were 11. What was there something specific that prompted that?
Yeah, I actually wrote a memoir, or like an essay, in 6th grade, about my grandmother who I'd never met, and this locket that my mom had with her picture in it. And which interestingly enough, my daughter is named after that grandmother. But I wrote it and it appeared in the local newspaper, the Courier Journal in Louisville. I did not know at the time it was in like the kids section. I just thought it was like,
whatever,
in the paper.
It counts.
Yeah, but it didn't matter. It didn't matter. It had kids ink on it,
Yeah.
But it was printed and I saw my byline and I was like, oh, that is cool. So I think originally it started out as like, I want to see my name in lights right here, But then
100%.
it sort of morphed into, journalism is such an incredible tool to get like accurate, important information out to the masses in a way that isn't, that's so different from entertainment or other media. So yeah, I just kept on going from there.
I love it. I'm going to ask you a question. Have you, which I know is why you're here, I'm a moron. Have you ever heard of a young woman named Hildy Lysiak?
Yeah.
She was a young reporter, very similar. She was about 8 years old. Her dad was an investigative journalist in sort of New York area and used to take her along to some, conversations and interviews that the children don't normally attend, some hard-hitting stuff. And eventually it broke him a little bit. And he said, well, we're going to move back to our small town and I'm going to write a book. And she was like, that's great for you, but I'm a journalist now. I can't just drop this willy-nilly. This is my calling. And they moved to this small town and she almost immediately scooped the local paper on a murder and published it in her blog. And the response from the community was not great. Like, hey, how dare you come in here, little girl, et cetera, et cetera. But it was correct. She made the news. She ends up getting a book deal. Hillary Clinton writes to her and says, keep doing what you're doing, all this stuff. I tell you this story because my wife made a TV show about her life a couple years ago called Home Before Dark. It was on Apple TV.
Well, maybe that's where I recognize that.
And
that's so cool.
It was, a similar vibe of people being like, one, you shouldn't do this for 1,000 reasons. Like, there's no 401k involved. But two, like, you're just a little girl. Like, what kind of stories do you tell? Whether it's in Kids Inc. or your adorable little blog. But there's so much power there, right? For yourself to say like, oh, I need to do this. And it was cool to see my name on the byline, but at the same time, like, what can I do with this tool? And it makes you kind of in whatever job you do, I guess, if you're a fireman, you walk around, you're like, that's a problem. That's a problem. That's a problem. When you're a journalist, it's easy to walk around and be like, there's so many stories to tell.
Yeah.
Anyways, I empathize with it. That was a big part of our life for quite a while.
That's really interesting. Yeah, and I think that one of the things I think is really important about this process in journalism is, Grist has had 25 years of this incredible environmental journalism, and still, the reason they brought me on, even like, and this being sort of like late in the game in terms of how long they've been around, but it's still being so important, is that that process that they were reporting with was still pretty linear. It was like, okay, we find the story, we give it to the people who read us, and then after that, they do with it what they will. And they have always done incredible, and more so over the years have really done some amazing, more justice focused journalism, reaching people through different events and things like that. But one of the reasons they brought me on was like, all right, how can we take that a step farther? And, they oftentimes, and a lot of newsrooms do this, and Grist has been doing an amazing job, is partnering with local news outlets like local radio stations or local nonprofit news, where we share a reporter and we get to like get those stories out, both, in Western North Carolina, like Blue Ridge Public Radio is one of our partners, and also in Grist, and show people in California or New York what is happening from someone who is on the ground, and often have those in two different media, right? Like audio and print. And I like to, that story you just told me reminds me of kind of taking it a step even further, which is equipping people with the means to do journalism themselves. And so that's sort of like the next phase of this work. And like, I've already done this a couple of times, both at Grist and when I was running Southerly, is having a training program to teach people how to identify misinformation, what the ethics are of journalism, how to write and how to take photos, and how, like, what's like to be edited, so that when they do post something, even if it's just posting something online or hosting a YouTube show, they have in the back of their minds, like, they don't have to necessarily be a journalist or call themselves a journalist, right? Or like be pitching ideas to the local newspaper, but doing journalism in the way of like making sure they're getting accurate information out to people is really important. And a lot of people are doing that anyway. And so, or if they write an op-ed for their local newspaper, like now they have some stuff that they know how to like file a public records request or do an interview. And that, I think, is the most amazing kind of ultimate goal of this work, is how we can't, with the system that we have in journalism, solve all of the problems that misinformation has caused, right? Like, we can't be in every single tiny rural community and address every single environmental issue all at once. So what better way to do that, to try to do that, right, than to teach people how to do that, and learn from them in the process. And then they can go to their communities and say like, oh, hey, I went to my church last Sunday and I taught everybody like how to fact check, or I've had people say that, right? Like, oh, and then I went and I testified at the local like public service commission hearing because I knew that they were like, they needed somebody to talk about it from this community, or whatever it might be. And I think that is a really amazing way to give people, again, like agency over their stories, and also give people oftentimes like there's just the confidence they need. Like, they know what they're talking about. People know what's happening to them, and they might not talk about it in the same way that sort of like we do at a national level or like politicians do, but people know way more than we often, especially journalists, often give them credit for. And I think that's it's just a really beautiful way to allow people to, kind of like share their own stories and be part of the process.
Of course, because you can't teach the intimacy they already have with the subject matter, however hyper local, about one elementary school or school board or church or town or whatever it might be. It is, and you can't teach the curiosity, right? Yeah. All you can do is help foster it by giving them these proven tools of the trade that frankly can be extended further than you really used them in a long time. I want to take a step forward into sort of the pragmatic side of this. So, like you said, a place like Grist has been around for quite a while. Chicken and egg. Did you come to them and say, hey, listen, I think you could do more of this and I think I'm the person to do it? Or did they come to that first and go hunting for someone like you? And then I would love to get into the sort of working our way backwards from the farm worker pamphlets you all made, at least. What goes into the discussions and resources and budget meetings to make something like this happen? So how did this start?
Yeah, so I knew the folks at Grist for a while since I wrote for them a lot when I was a reporter. And when I was ending Southerly, I was like, I want to do this work still, and it would be great to do it at a place that has more resources than
Mm-hmm.
my tiny little publication. And so I approached a few people there and talked to them about sort of the goals that Grist had. And as I mentioned, they have a lot of these local news partnerships
Mm-hmm.
around the country. And so a big goal for them was trying to kind of connect the national media and the local media and start like meeting people more, doing more of the like pamphlets or flyers or like going to rural places that maybe don't have access to grist.org all the time, right? Or don't know about it
Mm-hmm.
because of their political leanings or whatever it may be. So they also wanted to kind of move in the direction that I think a lot of journalism outlets are moving into, which is how do we engage people more authentically than just storytelling. And so that's sort of how that came about. And I've worked on a few projects I started in January, and I've worked on a few projects since I've been here. One of them was like a 9-month long project in Georgia, which was on so there's a lot of misinformation and lack of information around just energy policy and regulation in the state of Georgia. And so I kind of did this with our radio partner in Atlanta, WABE. We did a kind of a reporting on the Public Service Commission, which regulates Georgia
Mm-hmm.
Power. I held a few listening sessions to meet people in their communities and talk about like what they wanted to read more of, what stories they thought were missing, and then use that information to assign those stories. Like, so our reporter and a freelancer got to do those stories, like answer those questions that people had. I also held one of the training programs I was talking about.
Mm-hmm.
That's what we did that in Georgia. We had 4 people go through this training for like 6 weeks, and then they worked on a project around information sharing and journalism in their communities around energy. And so, like, and that is sort of one bucket, like these long form projects where I can come in way before any of the like stories are assigned or the reporters actually go
Mm-hmm.
out to report on something. And at the beginning, we can say, like, what is the main like thing we're trying to find out here? And for this one, it was, all right, what do people know about this regulatory agency?
Mm-hmm.
And what do they want to know, and
Mm-hmm.
what would help them make better decisions when they vote, and so, or more informed decisions when they vote. And so that is sort of like where we came up with this idea of like, let's go in a few different communities. One was all Spanish speaking, so we held it in Spanish, had an interpreter there. The other ones were in specific neighborhoods in Atlanta and in Macon, and then we like from there that's when the storytelling process continued. Was we were like, all right, here's the things that people want to know, let's directly answer their questions, let's work on this for months. Had a newsletter that we kept sending out, that sort of thing. And then the other sort of bucket of work that I've been doing is this more responsive type of journalism, right? Like, it's Grist is always going to have reporters who are reporting on like a disaster that happens, like the 2 hurricanes that we just saw in the South, or some sort of like environmental catastrophe, or just general issues like public health issues that are
Mm-hmm.
happening all the time. And one big thing I'm trying to do is say, all right, we know that reporting is going to happen, so like, how can I kind of help the organization build into its process of like, all right, where do we start asking the question of like, how do we get this information out to everyone, not just like publishing it online? So with the farm worker piece, what happened was our reporter Ayurella Hornmuller, who's in Florida, was doing a big story on the sort of movement to try to get more food and information about food and disaster issues to farm workers in Florida, because there
Mm-hmm.
was just this huge gap. And the work that farm worker advocacy organizations were doing to meet them and make sure that they were getting fed, especially in times of disaster and hurricanes. And so she was doing that, and then she had another story that was about a report on sort of about these information gaps around disaster issues, emergency shelters, things like that like farm workers weren't getting, either because it wasn't in Spanish ever from the city or the county,
Mm-hmm.
or just because that information just was not accessible. And so once we started talking, I was like, oh, well, let's figure out, we need to translate these stories because it was just going to be in English with an English language outlet that was like a partner
Yeah.
that was co-publishing the story. Spanish speakers don't come to Grist to read something. So like, where can we get this published? And like, let's translate it and get it published somewhere else. And it ended up getting published in a Spanish language outlet. And then from there, like I had 2 Zoom conversations, one in English with some farm worker advocacy orgs in Florida. And I asked them like, all right, what are the biggest issues? Because this story is about sort of like the plight, right? Like the gaps that farm workers face in accessing this information. But like, they don't necessarily need to read that. They need like the actual information, right? So how can we
They're
get
well
this
aware of the gaps.
Yeah, right, exactly. Like we don't need a pamphlet about that. So what happened was the farm worker organization were like, here are the things that people want to know. Like, what are my rights? What happens if I get asked to get an ID if I go to like a FEMA recovery center after a hurricane? Where do I get food? How do I get disaster SNAP, which is a thing that comes up after disasters? Like, what if I'm undocumented? What are my options if I can't apply for federal food programs? Those sorts of questions. And so what I did was designed this after that conversation, and then a conversation with a few folks that are community health workers in Florida, and that was in Spanish. And so there was an interpreter, and like I wasn't really part of the conversation. I was just kind of there to kind of guide it. We figured out, all right, here's what we should put in this brochure. And it was a lot of, like I said, that information and links to sites that they needed to go to, information about like organizations where they could get food, that sort of thing. And then I had the people I spoke to look at it and say, hey, is this what you all think people need? Like, are there any gaps? Like, can you make sure it aligns with like the language that you're using to describe these things and the values that you all are trying to like share with folks on the ground? Because I don't want to like do something that's totally, like at odds with what they're trying to do. Yeah. And, we're just providing information. And so what they did was I printed this out and then mailed like 1,600 copies to several different locations of their organizations, and they took it to workshops and took it out into the fields to farm workers, and hopefully that information will become useful. Like there's a QR code that they could go to the Spanish language version online. And once we did it in Spanish, one of the groups was like, hey, we have a lot of folks that speak Haitian Creole. And that was a really amazing opportunity for me because I had never done this sort of work in any language other than Spanish. And so being able to, I had to like track down someone who could translate into Haitian Creole, and they did that, and we got both the digital and the print version done. And so now they have that in 2 languages, like 2 most spoken languages for the workers. And again, like that impact is so hard to track because you're like, we know how many we sent out.
Sure.
But hopefully it's in the hands of people who are like, especially after Milton hit and after Helene hit, like that, if they do go to an emergency shelter, if they do go to try to find food, like at least they know the questions to ask or like things to look out for. And I didn't really realize it would be so timely because, it happened like a month before those storms hit, but it's that kind of like responsive work. And once you have a template for that, then you can use that in other communities and other populations and get it translated in other languages and, use it in North Carolina instead of Florida. And so, because there are farm workers there too. So I think that is the most amazing part of something like that is like you have it ready before a crisis happens. And then you can like respond even quicker next time, which is yeah.
So, I mean, really, it's so admirable. I mean, you guys really took it from getting it to these particular organizations and farm to translating it not just into Spanish, which is obviously the right thing to do, but also Haitian Creole. You're listening to the community, taking it, doing the work, doing it again, getting it back out there, hoping it's correct. There has to be a little trust that, okay, hopefully this changes a few lives, right? Helps folks if this happens. How does Grist measure the return on investment for your time and these materials and all of this travel and work and contractors you're hiring to translate things? How does that factor? And again, I'm coming at it from the perspective of, again, someone like the 19th or Capital B, which are, semi-well-funded, but so many other amazing independent organizations or independent reporters who are trying to do a version of what you did with Southerly, whatever it might be. How do you not justify it? I mean, morally, you can obviously justify it. It's incredible work. But budgets are budgets, and journalism's in a tough spot, even for someone like Grist. How does that part work?
Yeah, it's a really good question because I think that, when I was running Southerly, I think the hardest thing about, like, when you pitch this idea, especially to funders or just to anyone, they're like, yeah, that's amazing. Do it. Like, that's incredible. You should meet people where they're at. You should be able to print stuff and hand it out. And then when you talk about how long it takes and how many resources it takes just to, not just the money to like print something, right? But it's also the time and energy to, I'm doing a lot of the logistics and communicating, whether we're hosting an event or putting together, designing a pamphlet, right? Like our design team is way booked up. They can't design this pamphlet. So they had to kind of teach me how to design it on my own, and then I could
Sure.
do it. And then, or even just, the designing a website, the back end of that, like making sure that like we did a plain text version of a website and a fancy version, like those sorts of things that take time and energy.
I
I
saw the
think,
plain text version, sorry to interrupt, and I
oh yeah,
thought something was wrong with my browser, and then I refreshed it, and I was like, oh, this is fucking genius. It's like the SMS stuff where you're just like, get rid of all the other shit. It doesn't
yeah,
matter.
yeah. I saw one of our partners, but Blue Ridge Public Radio did that after Helene, and I was like, and so I made sure that we could do it and
Yep.
got it. Yeah. It's like, duh, right? But it's just those things you don't think about. And so again, like when you're pitching it to funders, I think that it's very buzzy. Community engagement is a very buzzy thing in journalism right now. And so everyone wants to do it. And then when you talk about how long it takes, the effort it takes, and that, just one person at a big organization like Grist, like it requires a lot of help. Like I need reporters to help me get the information because I can't be a reporter and this, which is sometimes I am doing that, but like having a reporter on board to like do some of that back end work and do the reporting and like help me fact check it, like that's so helpful and critical and amazing because Grist has people who want to do this work and really believe in this work, and so that has been really important. When I came on to like the whole of 2024, I had just come on, so like I didn't have a budget, so I was over here like, hey, can I have $1,000 to print this? Like, or to run this through FedEx, that sort of thing. And so luckily for the next year, I have a lot more money to be able to say, all right, here's a budget for printing. Here's a budget for like events and things. And here is like, maybe we want to do a fellowship again. Cause the fellowship that we ran that was 6 weeks long, I paid everyone a few $1,000, and like, because they were using their time. And when we held listening session, I paid people to be there to participate, and they weren't used as sources ever again or anything like that. But like, I feel it's really important to pay people for their time. And so I think that is a difficult conversation, not just at Grist, but in general in journalism, is like, we kind of just expect people to give us their time. And obviously like there's a line, like we can't quote them as sources after we pay them. Like that is not how this works.
Of course.
But if we want people to do the work, particularly like low income, people of color, like people in rural areas where we go into their community and we're like, hey, help us figure out how to do our work better, then, they need to be paid for their time. And so that part of the budget, I think, is a really difficult conversation sometimes, because it like makes it blurry with the ethics of like what, how a lot of journalists think that like it should go. Like, no, they should just give it to us. And so that I think is sort of like the hardest sell. I talk to the funding team, the development team at Grist a decent amount. And I think that one of the really amazing things is like community engagement, and like the work that I'm doing is sort of this bridge between the audience side and the editorial side of newsrooms, where oftentimes they're very distant. It's like, okay, we're putting our stuff out on social media, we're like communicating with the audience in that way, and then we're like deciding all our editorial goals over here. And I think this is a way to bridge those two and say, all right, how do we ask people what they want or need and then decide our editorial goals, or rather than making sure the editorial process like always informs what we're doing for our audience. And so I think that is a really hopefully better way to like fundraise around that. And I hope that I see a lot of other newsrooms doing that too, but it is, for this Helene thing, I got $1,000 to like print out some stuff, flyers on like how to access FEMA aid. And then we had a QR code that went to that plain text site. And then I got some assistance through another organization where we got the flyer actually printed in a local, I'm forgetting the word. What is it called? Alt Weekly, Mountain Express. And they printed it in their edition this week, and it's going out to 20,000 people in 5 counties. And so it's like, how can we work together with other newsrooms, because everyone is so strapped, to like make sure we get those resources, because like everyone has, you know, something to give in that way, whether it's time or energy or money. And so unfortunately and fortunately, that's like the position we're in, you know? I mean, it's amazing, but it sucks. I wish we weren't in that.
Yes. Great. Yeah, 100%. And, you know, you hope that Grist is making enough money elsewhere that as you build these playbooks for, and I kind of thought about how you all are doing, you know, what we're all doing, which is adaptation and mitigation at the same time. You know, hey, here's how to access FEMA on a plain text site or by SMS when you're already affected because you're a farm worker with no leave or heat protections. But at the same time, you're doing things like, hey, here's how a public utility commission works, and in particular, one in Georgia or mine here in Dominion, you know, which is like a black box that they would very much like to remain a black box, and how you can affect that so that hopefully we can start to tame this whole thing a little bit. It's a dance. And again, you have to justify the cost of all these things, and you wish you didn't have to, but at the same time, like you said, there's partners out there that can actually rely on the trust that they've built with their communities, like these alt weeklies or Blue Ridge Public Radio, who say like, hey, we've already got this audience of people who are really engaged and trust us. We're going to trust you to do something kind of from the outside that you think is going to help them. But like, you got to perform. You got to show up and have these conversations. You got to buy the donuts. You can't pay people specifically for one thing, but you can pay them for this. And hopefully you can train more people. It's an effort. And I do hope that Grist's funders and all these other places are looking at it and going, yes, it needs to have a budget. Yes, she cannot just run wild buying everything for everyone here. She cannot just live at FedEx and choose the glossy option. But at the same time, maybe this isn't the specific part of our operations where we expect even a reasonable return on interest. You know, hopefully we can make that up elsewhere so that we can do this kind of work. Do you feel like hopefully it's heading in that sort of direction?
Yeah, I do. I think that, and again, I think it's been sort of a slow movement, and now we finally, because of the number of news outlets that are doing this kind of work and doing different kinds of journalism, training people, printing things, doing SMS-based reporting, like that's more mainstream now. And so I think now the funders are finally catching up with it, right? Are like, oh, okay, this is how we get more information out to people. And I think it's hard to, one of the things that I always try to get across and I think is really helpful is, you know, as we are sort of like deciding what's worth paying for, as far as like how to get information out, or what partnership is worthwhile, or like if we're going to reach enough people, or like should we experiment with this new way of getting information out. Like meanwhile, all of the fossil fuel companies, all of the, you know, the heritage foundations of the world, all of, you know, these organizations and people with really dangerous misinformation, like they're going to schools and they're going to churches and they're hosting events. Yeah. Yes. And they're writing op-eds and they're, you know, trying to get their stuff published on the, you know, local news. Like that machine is constantly working. And, you know, we're kind of coming at a deficit where like those communities that we're trying to reach are already like in it with all of that misinformation. And so how do we like, let's just like put our resources and time towards that. Like there's an urgency here that I think sometimes isn't, you know, really respected. Like it's like, oh, we'll have time to figure out like how the best way to do it. And it's like, no, let's just like throw stuff at the wall and see what sticks. Let's like collaborate. Let's stop trying to scoop each other and just like get this stuff out there. And I think that's like a constant battle that I think it's slowly changing, right? Like there's more collaborations and working together than there used to be, but you know, it's like, this is all happening while we're, you know, trying to figure this out. So the least we can do is just like try stuff, right? That's sort of the spot we're in right now.
It's like a journalism version of mutual aid almost.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. Yeah. Which it's like, you know, you think about it, you're like, like mutual aid is amazing, and would be great if like these things could be provided by the government or the systems of power that should be doing it. And
I mean,
same with
it's
journalism, but it is what it is.
it's easy and cliche, but and there's some very poorly run nonprofits, things like that, that have a big name, this and that are wasteful, just like any company or government or whatever it might be. But at the same time, again, and we kind of work in the realm of all the make or break things here. So we're not just worried about Helene, we're worried again about, zero heat protections and all that everyday stuff. Like you said, that's just happening. But there's also organizations like one that's near and dear to my heart is Alex's Lemonade Stand. And they do two things. They fund research into pediatric cancer and all these incredible doctors and scientists and their whole support mechanisms. But they also fund specifically travel for families who need to go to treatment or clinical trials, whatever it might be, because that is just because you got in doesn't mean you can afford to travel to Philly or wherever. And nothing turns me into like radicalized Batman more than when people are like, well, are they wasting money? It's like, what they would love is for just there not to be kid cancer. Like it would be great if this just wasn't a problem in the fucking first place, obviously. Or if there was enough funding in general to just, they didn't have to do this work and see kids who are sick, all of that. Like,
yeah.
Again, it's like the whole, oh, look how much this billionaire donated. That's great. It would be great if our entire health system didn't rely on GoFundMe and billionaire donations. Like,
exactly. Yeah.
But in the meantime, like, we do have to build the trust and we have to do the work because that's where we are. So you try to change the game while we've got to play by the rules that exist. Because like you said, and this is a lot of what we try to do, in our work, and also this new app thing we've launched is it's like treating any illness is deal with the cause and deal with the symptoms. We have to try to pass laws for universal, free, healthy school lunches, but also there's people that need to eat tonight, and we need to feed them. And I appreciate that you are of the opinion of, no, we have to throw shit at the wall because we can't just wait,
Yeah, it's true. I mean, like, I would love there to be more government funding for media. And I mean, like, in this kind of group where we're like trying to like advocate for policies to improve like funding for journalism in general, just like for public broadcasting, like what does that look like in other parts of journalism? And like, yes, that's incredibly important. And at the same time, as we've seen, in North Carolina right now, there was news yesterday that and other federal like officials were told to leave because like a militia was coming in trying to quote unquote like hunt FEMA. And you have like when misinformation has created that many dangerous situations, like it's urgent, right? Like we have to, this is not just a thing we can kind of slowly address. Like we are, obviously because of the election, but like just in general, it's always like, it's like this in so many other areas. We just aren't paying as much attention. And so I think journalism has a bigger role, like the industry in general has a bigger role in addressing that than I think, we're often like, oh, well, nonprofits and, other organizations are doing this kind of work on the ground. It's like, no, like we're the ones on the ground that like need to make sure, like it's our job to make sure people have a healthy information ecosystem because that's so vital to their lives. And I think that's such an important thing to me, and it becomes more important all the time, not just in times of like a hurricane, but in general, like getting the point across to people all over the US and internationally that like not just a free media, but like a media that's like well funded and like and diverse and socio or economically, racially, geographically, like we have to make sure that this continues because we're seeing in real time like the dangers of what happens when it doesn't.
And also just this, on one hand, I guess practically budget-wise, and because there is so much to cover, this version of journalism and policy where, again, you kind of do something and then take your foot off the pedal and go like, well, okay, we've reported on it. Hopefully that's out there. But again, I have these barometers of like, okay, is there still a place in the U.S. that people like semi-affectionately call Cancer Alley? Because if there is, then we're probably not done yet. They need better information.
Totally.
They have the information. They're being told misinformation because we keep building shit. And again, we call it Cancer Alley. It feels like there's still more to do.
Yeah.
It feels like something could be better funded. I don't know, how you pick the order, but it feels like there's more to do. It's just, fuck.
Yeah. I know it's so overwhelming sometimes that, it's, and I'm sure, organizers and everybody feels like this all the time, like healthcare workers, teachers, like you're just like,
Totally.
damn, like how can I make some sort of change? And like, it just feels like I'm not doing anything. Like I'm just spinning my wheels. And I think the way I think about it is there's a little corner that I can work on, right? And that is like, right now it's in Western North Carolina. I can get this FEMA information out, and hopefully people will see a FEMA official. Maybe one person sees somebody in a FEMA jacket and is like, they're not going to seize my land. They're trying to get, like, I'm going to apply for money that hopefully I can get from them. And it's a messy process. And there's a lot of faults that the federal government has in this situation, right? A lot of reasons for distrust. But if I could just like maybe work on that little corner and then hopefully like replicate it, then, that's all I can hope for, I guess.
You do have to moderate your expectations a little bit. We're fond of saying like, people write in and say things like, I heard the jet stream slowing down. What can I do? And I'm like, not much. However, here's a million things you can do depending on what you're interested in and what your skills are and what your resource or money-wise or time-wise capable of, knowing the typical constraints of like, we're a country without childcare, like that is a constraint, baseline. But at the same time, again, we use this phrase, which is all you can do is all you can do, which is like, if you are able to control something and affect it, give it everything you got. But understand that there's certain forces and things that you're not going to be able to completely affect on your own or right now or more broadly. But again, hopefully it does scale in the way that you have built a playbook for this that maybe other media companies that exist or don't exist yet can look at and go, okay, maybe it doesn't actually cost that much to run these fellowships and this reporting and these pamphlets and all these type of things. Maybe that's somewhere we can pull costs back somewhere and apply it here. And where could we have that effect? Because you do have to do the work. We do have to do the work. And there's a lot. It's very easy to look around and be like, I've only affected one part of Western North Carolina. It's like, I know, but everyone else is ignoring them. So.
Yeah, definitely. And one of those things in journalism, I think, is, I always talk about like, when I was younger, all I wanted to do was like win a Pulitzer Prize, like I was like, that's my, when I was my 11, when I found out about the Pulitzer Prize, I was like, that's what I'm doing, but now in this work, you're like, yes, amazing, incredible. Congrats to everyone who's ever won a Pulitzer. And so many people are just competing for that. Right. And rather than thinking, where does this information go and who it could be life-saving. It could change someone's mindset. It might not change a policy at the federal level or, get as much attention, but it could change something on a smaller scale. And that's something I think about a lot and also yell about a lot whenever I
yell at everyone. I'm just shaking a rake in my front yard all of the time at people. But it does matter, and how you set your expectations and how you understand and operate within scales matters too. Again, I'm in Virginia and Virginia has become very purple, blue, back and forth sort of thing. But, the example I use whenever I tell people, please not stop giving to presidential races, but please give to state and local races is, I'm very familiar with a couple of the legislators who bare minimum passed Medicaid in Virginia, oh God, what was that now? 8 years ago. And overnight, 400,000 people, who most of which probably had never had any sort of health insurance before, got it. And that can be your scale. That's still a hell of a lot of people whose lives you more or less just changed. I have a friend who in Richmond, they have this big program. They built this big, beautiful pool. And part of the way they got funding from the city and the county and these private institutions, University of Richmond, was to say, we're going to make it free for every kid in Richmond to get swim lessons. And this guy I know, who's the executive director, showed me this big wall where they have a count every year from the schools and the different neighborhoods, how many kids they've taught to swim. And, it's 12,000 kids, something like that so far. And it's easy to be like, oh, there's 400 million people. It's like, okay, but if you've taught 12,000 kids to swim, you've probably, over the course of their collective lives and each of their lives, you've probably saved like 20 lives, which doesn't seem like a lot. I understand that in the grand scope of is the jet stream slowing down. But you can definitely go to sleep at night knowing that you are really doing something. And if you're building a plain text website and SMS for, Florida farm workers who are already fucked because of the system, or folks in Western North Carolina in a state that cannot decide what it wants to be and how it wants to help people, that's something to hang your hat on.
Yeah.
This is great. I've got a last couple questions, and I'm going to get you out of here. Is that all right?
Yeah, go for it.
Okay. What do you feel like, sort of in brief, this is the what can we do sort of thing. What of this playbook can sort of be summarized down as much as possible? What has been transferable, do you think, towards people who work in neighborhoods with lead pipes, which is many, Black neighborhoods, Latino neighborhoods, maternal health, whatever it might be? What of your playbook do you feel like can be transferable, and what have been things where you're like, well, this has been pretty unique to this specific situation? What can people start to adopt or at least think about ahead of time here?
Yeah. One thing I always like to say is, please copy what I'm doing.
Yeah.
I mean, it's like, don't plagiarize it if you don't mind. Like, you could paraphrase it, but take it is a template. And I think anyone can, in their community. There's so many people already doing this work. Like, if you are, I think there's a lot of folks, in general, I see a lot of women sort of like leading these efforts in their communities where they're like tracking pollution or trying to educate their neighbors, or start a citizens group or things like that. And that is, you're doing information access work, right? You're trying to make sure. And so I think, taking sort of lessons from not just what I'm doing, but other organizations that are doing really important community-centered journalism is like, how do I get use the tools of journalism to make sure it's accurate, make sure it's like fact-checked, like use the correct sources like that I can trust, and get that information out to people. And also like identifying misinformation. Like, if you see, no matter where you are, like if you see someone, I'm not advocating for like getting on Facebook fights all the time, but like if you see, because I did it the other day and it was not super successful, but like if
Why?
you see, like if you see somebody saying misinformation, whether you're like at your holiday dinner table or someone sharing something, you're like, I know that's inaccurate. Like, you don't necessarily have to do it publicly, but like, are there ways in your life where you can be like, hey, here's how I know that's not true. Here's where this information comes from. Like, I did this around like FEMA stuff just because that's something I feel very confident in addressing. And I think that those conversations suck. They're uncomfortable, but like we can all do better at just like engaging a little bit more with people that we're just like, I don't know, we're not going to agree. I think that is just like one tiny thing to do. In general, I like just taking this playbook. I think if, look for news outlets in your area that like support journalism, right? Like you don't have to necessarily subscribe to your local paper, but can you find, like, if you're in Atlanta, there's an organization called Canopy Atlanta that they train people to do journalism through fellowships, and they go out and write about issues in their neighborhoods, not just environmental ones. They also have a documenters program where you're paid to go to local meetings and take notes and publish them. And that's popping up in so many cities across the country. It's in Sacramento, it's in Chicago, it's in Philadelphia. You can look at that through City Bureau or Documenters online. There's just all these opportunities that aren't necessarily like the traditional media that you might see, that are doing things like the things that I'm talking about. And you can always start something like that yourself. It's useful to learn how to do like I said, the tools of journalism before, to make sure that you're doing it in a way that's like ethical and like people can trust. But if you're really interested in like storytelling and getting information out, like there are a lot of ways that you can do that, and you don't need a whole newsroom to back you up, and you could work with like a local organization in your community that's focused on a particular thing, like lead pipes or pollution or whatever it may be.
Sure.
And so I think there's kind of, at Southerly, I did, I could only print off like 100 brochures here and there, or 500 brochures, and now I can print off thousands. So like there's totally useful ways to do this at different scales. And I think it all starts with just kind of recognizing sort of what you're really passionate about and what kind of information gaps you see, and people when you're in your neighborhood and dealing with something that is a problem that maybe hasn't been recognized yet, like that's where you can be of the most use,
Sure, because nobody knows it better than you. You are of that space. Awesome. That's super, super helpful. Okay, last little lightning round questions. You've got lives to change here. Lyndsey, first time in your life when you realized you had the power of change or the power to do something meaningful to someone besides yourself?
Oh my gosh. That's a really hard question. The first time in my life.
We've had answers from third grade class council to 6 months ago to anything.
I think it probably was, I don't know, this is kind of late, but like when I was in grad school in Chicago, and I was writing about children's health and had to write a lot about like asthma and stuff on the South Side. And really just, I think I got an email or a note from somebody that I was a student run website that was not, super well circulated or anything. And I got a note that, like someone had read that and had impacted, how they thought about this issue, and they were going to like share it with people. And I've gotten many of those over the years. And I think every single time I'm like, oh, this, like people read things and change their minds about something or can use that somewhere. And so that was like the first time I remember that really well, but it's happened a million times since that it always surprises me.
And that's also just great feedback for folks, which one of the things I'm trying to figure out how to program into this tool thing is how to just write your journalist or newspaper or radio station and say, thank you for covering this thing, because it does go a long way to not just the person doing the work, but the organizations who's like, oh, I'm glad we spent resources on Lyndsey's pamphlets. People appreciated that. So
that's great. And I feel like I need to do that to so many people, not just, journalists, but just like people I see quoted in things, or like just try to track people down more often and be like, thanks so much for that information or for what you did,
Yeah. Well, thank you for sharing that. Last one, what is a book that you've read in clearly all of your free time over the past year or so that has affected you in some way, changed your thinking in some way, opened your mind to maybe a topic you hadn't considered before?
I do put off a lot of other things so I can read, because I love reading. But I'm actually reading a book right now. I'm not done with it yet, so I can't speak to like it being finished, but it's called The Quickening by Elizabeth Rush. And it's about motherhood and a trip that she takes to Antarctica to write about the melting glaciers, and kind of combining like the idea of like continuing our legacy, right? And becoming a parent. And I've already become a parent, but it's just so interesting to kind of see her weave in that together with climate change, because I think oftentimes that's an either or thing that people decide, like, if you care about the earth, you can't have kids, or like vice versa. It becomes a crazy conversation. And this is just a really nuanced, beautiful way to talk about the future of our planet in a beautiful, optimistic way and in a very depressing way. And also I'm just learning a ton about Antarctica that I had no idea about.
So cool. I love that. Well, thank you for sharing that. I will add it to my truly endless list of things I need to get to.
Endless.
And
the nightstand is full. Yeah.
Right. And my kids are, I've been trying to do this new thing. My kids are 9, 10, and 11. And I've been just reading not just with them, but they're like, hey, I read this book. You would like it. I was like, fuck it. I'll read that. Let me push aside that whole book stand. And it's actually really fun. It's a great way to connect with them.
That's so cool.
It's just, and also like the books are great. And it's a great way to just keep having conversations with them before they're going to start ignoring me very soon. But, you know, I don't know. I don't know what the point was, but it's nice to connect in that way.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it's really nice to connect in that way. And I appreciate books that have that kind of perspective to them,
Mm-hmm.
you know, which is thinking about things a little more comprehensively. There's a wonderful new book by a gentleman I just had on the show named Ferris Jaber, I think his name is. Not about parenthood, but just the earth is sort of a living organism and all the ways it actually works and, you know, how we're affecting it. It's affected us and all that. It's quite lovely.
That's neat.
Anyways, that's it. Where can folks follow your intrepid work?
.org, GRIST.org is where all my stuff is. I'm the senior manager of community engagement, so you won't see my stuff on the front page, but if you dig a little bit, you can find the community engagement stuff. There's grist.org/updates is like where we post a lot of the stuff that we're doing with this kind of work. And then once you're there, you can see a lot of our partners work too, like Blue Ridge Public Radio, WAB in Atlanta, Deep South Today. So there's all over the country. We have partners. So I encourage everyone to look through that too, because that's where we'll see a lot of the stuff that I'm working on.
I love it. Thank you so much for your time and for this awesome work. I really appreciate, you know, when folks say, what can I do? You seem to have really asked this question, which is like, how far can I take it? You know, it's a little bit like the rural broadband thing. It's not enough to just build towers. Like, you got to connect people. We have to do that work or else they're left out of this thing. So I appreciate that. It's pretty awesome.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for having me on. This is really fun.
That's it. Important Not Important is hosted by me, Quinn Emmett. It is produced by Willow Beck, and the music is by Tim Blaine. You can read our critically acclaimed newsletter and get notified about new podcast conversations at importantnotimportant.com. Thanks so much for listening, and thanks for giving a shit.